Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to come out and join MEF17. My name's Kevin, as I mentioned. I'm responsible for business products at Comcast. For those of you who might not be familiar with Comcast, we're the largest cable provider in the US. We cover about 45% of the country. So this is actually my second tour of duty on the MEF board. I was on the board a few years ago, and I can't imagine a better time to rejoin what's going on with the MEF. MEF 3.0 is such a pivotal moment as the MEF starts to look beyond just caring for layer 2 and just caring for Ethernet, and really starting to think about caring for the whole stack and starting to really think about the larger virtualization problem and interoperability problems. So really congratulations to Nan and everybody who worked so hard to get MEF 3.0 to the starting gate here, and I think it's just the start of a really fantastic next generation for the MEF. So as we talked this morning, a big part of MEF 3.0 is the discussion of SD-WAN. And I thought I would center my comments today over SD-WAN and indeed our unique perspective on SD-WAN. One of the beauties of the MEF is that it brings together so many different companies, right? You have some of the largest telcos in the world. You have small startups working on software. You have insurgent networks like Comcast. And it becomes this rich melting pot of discussion and perspectives. And so I want to talk about our very unique perspective into SD-WAN. And our unique perspective is that we are a last mile network operator, and we are an insurgent last mile network operator. And so we have a real view of what's going on at layer 1, what's going on in the dirt, as I like to say, what's going on with that last mile network asset. Because it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, everything we're talking about here, all this exciting stuff, ultimately traverses a last mile into a business location. And we actually see the convergence of two technologies coming together that we've sort of termed it a generational moment. That our industry is always apace with new technology and things are changing. But every so often something comes along that is a break point in the industry. A moment where you say, if you lived through that change, there was a before and there was an after. You think of narrowband to broadband. You think of circuit to packet, fixed to mobile. These are moments in time that all of us who lived through them said, wow, I remember the industry before that happened, and I remember the industry after that happened, and it was a different industry. And the two forces we see coming together right now are the broad deployment of gigabit broadband in the last mile. We are entering the gigabit era, and it will fundamentally transform how we think about business networking. The second is software-defined networking, right? And all of you are very involved in this. I like to think of it as it's time to end the tyranny of the boxes, where every function has a box and every box has a function, and they each have a power supply that's going to fail and a security patch that's out of date, and we don't know how the wires were groomed, but when it fails, we have to regroom it all because the last person didn't do it right. We've all seen it. We all live it. When you put these two forces together, a revolutionary change, really a revolutionary change in what happens in the last mile, alongside a revolutionary change of how you build and run network functions, you're going to have a generational moment. You're going to see the fundamental elimination of bandwidth barriers in the last mile on a scale unheard of. You're going to see radical simplification. Every little bit about how you run a network, how you plan it, how you provision it is going to change, and going to change in a dramatic fashion. And you're going to see price compression like our industry hasn't experienced in a very, very long time. So this is our lens, and I want to talk more about how we see these two things playing together. So I want to talk about our perspective. So much of how we think about life is shaped by the experiences that we bring to the table. So I want to talk about the perspective of a large last mile cable operator, right, particularly in the United States. It's pretty interesting that 22 years ago, before the Telecom Act of 1996, it was illegal for us to compete with the phone companies. Pretty shocking, actually, to think about that world in retrospect, that at one point people thought for sure you could never port a number for the emergency services and all kinds of bad things would happen if you allowed competition in telecom. We changed that in 1996. And from that point, the cable industry made about $100 billion of investments in its last mile. If you went back and found the cable network of 1996, what you would find is a one-way analog network carrying maybe 50, 60 channels of analog television. And if you were in a particularly sophisticated community, you might have been able to press a button on your remote control, and it would send this tiny little signal back up to the head end saying, Kevin wants to watch Wayne's World or whatever it was we were watching in the mid-90s. From this explosion of investment, the cable industry has transformed its asset from a one-way analog asset into a very fiber-deep, fiber-rich, hybrid fiber coax asset with strong two-way capabilities, a giant downstream capacity, and a very large upstream capacity. The industry byproduct of that has been the emergence of cable, not just in the US, but in many locations, and certainly not just Comcast, lots of companies in our position. You know, in the US, we're the largest residential broadband provider in the company, the 4th largest phone company in the country, one of the largest small business CLECs, a very large player in Metro E, and a large player in cell backhaul. And the reason we can do that is this picture on the right. So what the picture on the right is a picture of Comcast's fiber network in the greater Chicago area, right? This is the fiber that goes out into all the last miles. I'd like to say there's any number of companies that can put up a chart that says, here's the backbone that connects all these cities. There's almost nobody else who can stand up here and say, let me show you how deep the fiber goes out past strip malls and business parks and schools and governments and firehouses, right? And what's interesting is if you zoomed in this map again and laid in the coax legs that come off the end of that fundamental translation from light to RF into people's businesses and places of work, you would see the map basically totally covered in gray. You couldn't see it because that's how deep the network is. This asset is a fundamental asset to how the rest of the industry plays out because it brings bandwidth to where customers are, and that bandwidth shapes how we need to think about SDN and SD-WAN. So just not an advertisement, but to give you a sense of the shape of what we're doing at Comcast, and other cable operators are going to be very much on this same journey. We recently launched a technology called DOCSIS 3.1, which is the next generation specification for last mile bandwidth in the cable network. It provides a gigabit of bandwidth, and we're out there in the market at $499. This isn't a gigabit of bandwidth to tall, shiny buildings. It's not a gigabit of bandwidth to places that have fiber. It's a gigabit of bandwidth to virtually every business and home, actually, in our service territory. It's unheard of, the ability to go to a doctor's office and transactionally plug a gigabit of bandwidth in. To be able to go to a quick serve restaurant and say, how would you change how you run your entire network and all your applications if I could drop a gigabit of bandwidth to your restaurant transactionally on about 7 days' notice and in the form factor of a small cable modem. Revolutionary type stuff, and it's going to change how we do our network job across virtually every vertical. And as you can see from the list on the right, this is most of the major cities in the United States. There's a couple other cable companies that have the balance of the major cities in the United States. I think when you look up in 18 months, 2 years, you'll find that almost every major city in the US now has this transactional gigabit capability. It's an amazing change. And I think it's hard to get your head wrapped around just how big that change is. So what's interesting is today in the US, there are still so many T1s deployed out there. It's gobsmacking that it's 2017, and you have customers who are still running their network on 1.5 megabits of bandwidth. Can you even imagine? This is what their world looks like. They are torturing kilobits of bandwidth through this old technology to serve these different applications. It's stunning to me that this goes on, but it does in lots and lots of businesses. And so there's still, there's one creeping along, right? Just really want to get through there. So you sit there and you say, okay, we all know how they manage bandwidth today. Well, maybe I got to add another T1, and that's got, you know, God knows how long of a provisioning cycle, and I got to bond it together, and now I have 3 megs, can you imagine? And so then we say, oh, let's go to 4.5, this is going to be great. Okay, let's go to 6. Oh, we're really flying now. You've got to be kidding me, all right? And if you understand how intrusive this is, I was with the head of networking for a very large restaurant chain the other day, a while back actually now, and he said to me, one of my big problems is Pandora. I said, how can that be a problem? He said, well, it turns out that line cooks chopping vegetables, getting ready for dinner, like to listen to music while they do it. And when you're dealing with a hairpin network of MPLS running over T1s, music streams simply bring your network to its knees. And I thought, wow, that's got to be an edge case, until the head of systems for a large healthcare concern who was sitting at the other side of the table said to me, I have the exact same problem because surgeons like to stream music during surgery. And I went, wow, this is my kind of situation, right? You've got, my daughter gets in her car and drives around Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, streaming music to her heart's content. It's not even an issue, but you've got major, major corporations wrestling with this. And if you think this is just the T1 area, if you think this is just the backward-looking TDM, MPLS world, think about the fraction of loops in the Metro Ethernet space that are 10 megs and below, 20 megs and below. Our customers still live in an incredibly narrow band world. It's shocking in the amount of bandwidth that is now flowing around. So let's talk about what a gigabit means. I think it's hard to kind of get your head wrapped around it. So we decided to make it visual. That's to scale. So if you take 6 megs and you push it into what looks like a gigabit pipe, it just disappears into irrelevance. And you can now put hundreds of megabits per second against your favorite application. This is transformational, and it changes how you have to think about SD-WAN. You know, a lot of the things we've done in Metro E and in other technologies, we're very heavy on how do I mark the packets, how do I do the queuing, how do I do all of this heavy management of applications with a lot of configuration requirements, fundamentally because it was dealing with the deficiencies of the layer 1 network. It was dealing with the fact that you were in a narrowband world where you had to mark all these things and keep it in order and keep it in priority, or you were going to have bad phone experiences. You weren't going to have good application performance. When you can throw a gigabit of bandwidth at something for $500 in almost every place you're trying to conduct business, so much of that energy is backward looking. I'm not saying it's unnecessary. There are certainly applications that are going to continue to require this, but you're going to be able to do so much more over the top with layer 3 queuing simply because bandwidth solves so many sins. And as it becomes ubiquitous, you exit a place where you have to build to this lowest common denominator. I'm only expecting to be able to get 5 or 6 or 10 megs because that's all I can really count on getting, to where you can breathe some fresh air and say, I can get a gigabit. I can get a gigabit like wherever I want it. That changes how we do these things. And it has to have a fundamental insight in how we make our investments in software-defined wide area networking and other SDN. So that's our perspective as we talk about SD-WAN. That's what we think the world looks like, and that shapes how we're investing and trying to bring SD-WAN and SDN to life. We're building for a gigabit world because we're entering the gigabit era. So let's pivot a little bit to what we're doing in SD-WAN. I'll talk about how that's shaping it. So very recently, you heard us announce a platform, maybe. You heard us announce a platform called ActiveCore. It's our SDN implementation, fully hosted, carrier grade. One of the great things about working at Comcast is we operate a lot of services in the cloud already, so we have a very, very industrial grade, nationwide cloud capability. We were able to build right on the back of that. Full VNF orchestration, right from the get-go. A groundbreaking digital experience. So we've really invested heavily in making this simple. One of the things that we think is a moment in time that, again, is are we looking backwards or are we looking forwards, is if you're looking forwards, you're recognizing that skills are scarce and we need to simplify this, right? That we can't bring the complexity of the past into the future. We will never get it out. And we think a key aspect of this is digital. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then table stakes, touchless integration. This has to be simple. Our first product on top of the ActiveCore platform is SD-WAN. No surprise there. What may be a surprise for a cable company and a last mile operator is we built it over the top. I'm not saying we'll never do layer 3, layer 2 queuing and management and stitching that together, but we looked at the gigabit world and we said, I don't think that's the best use of money right now. I think the best use of money is getting a wonderful over-the-top service out there that's going to take advantage of this explosion in bandwidth. So a bit contrarian for a network operator. We're starting over the top. We'll see where the world takes us on things that aren't. Designed for hybrid WAN. You know, fundamentally, SD-WAN is going to challenge the MPLS market. MPLS is not going away overnight. Who's kidding who? 15 years from now, we're all going to be in a room like this, and people are still going to be using MPLS. Big technology transformations do not happen overnight, but they do start to shift. And I think MPLS was a brilliant technology in its day. It remains a fundamental underpinning of a lot of what goes on in the world. But the reality is it was built in an era when you had tens of devices accessing a few applications in bandwidth measured in kilobits or megabits. We're now in a world where hundreds of devices or thousands of devices are accessing hundreds of applications in bandwidth measured in gigabits. It's time for the emergence of the new technology. So we think you have to walk into this with a hybrid WAN mentality. We aren't thinking a lot of our customers are going to go, thank God, let's rip out that MPLS network overnight. Very unlikely. We do think they're going to get on this path to start taking advantage of this low-cost bandwidth and as fast as they possibly can, cycle down all that expensive, complex T1 kind of technology and get over into more this gigabit kind of world. Keep it simple, obviously includes a router and firewall, and we've emphasized simplifying policy management, really not just technically, but also experientially through the digital experience. So when we think about active core, and when we think, again, this is our perspective as the world moves forward here, there's 4 key components. Foundational, gigabit powered. It's got to be built for a mass market gigabit world from the day you take it out the door. And that reflects in how you architect the servers. It also reflects in how you architect the universal CPE. We want to make sure that from the day we show up, you can throttle that network up to a gigabit and you will be just fine. So you really start to think about what asset, what platform am I investing in, because I got to get my money in the right spot for the long term. Second, full VNF orchestration, universal CPE from the get-go. Obviously, this is where everyone is heading. We agree. Hosted carrier-grade solution. We think this has to be fully in the cloud. Know where do you want your controller shipped, which data center. We think this has to be a cloud-based service. We don't ever really want our customers to have anything other than universal CPE going forward. And finally, the integrated digital experience. I said I would come back to this. We think it's a moment to bring consumer-style digital experience development to the IT problem, to the systems problem. We look at a lot of digital environments to control these complicated technologies, and I joke that they're like the inside of a 747 cockpit. There's a switch for everything, and everything has a switch. It's very difficult to manage in that environment. And so we tried to ask ourselves, how can I get as many of the switches and knobs out of the way as humanly possible and just make this simple? I was talking with someone who was running a very large SD-WAN implementation, and I asked her, what's your biggest problem? She said, finding anybody who knows how to work this stuff. And so simplifying it has got to be key so that we can invest our energy in applications and other things that drive the business. We thought part of simplifying it was putting the technology where the people are. It turns out there's only 2 ways any of us run our life anymore. Either you get up and you check your smartphone and then make the coffee, or you get up and make the coffee and then check your smartphone. There's no third option. And tea drinkers, I don't get it. So you sit there and you say, well, I want to be with you. And so we built a native mobile application for both iOS and Android so that wherever you are, you can see your entire network. You can see real-time latency, packet loss, jitter, and it becomes an engine to bring more and more insights to the network right into the palm of your hands. When you show this to an IT manager, it's transformational, and that's part of thinking through how do we use SDN and invest in the future to transform how people run networks. So I want to end where I began, right, which is this generational moment. I think if you view SDN and SD-WAN in a vacuum, you see wonderful things that can happen with virtualization. You see sort of how we take costs out of the business, how we simplify it. But unless you also view it through the lens of what is happening in the last mile, how is this changing? I think you wind up walking down the wrong path, because you're still asking yourself 2,000 type questions. How do I do real-time bandwidth on demand? That's a very interesting question if what you're trying to do is manage something where you've got a scarce 10 megabits, you don't really feel like paying for 5 of it's going to cost you a lot, so you're willing to jump through all these gymnastics to not have to pay for that, but get bandwidth on demand. That is an utterly irrelevant question if I can put a gigabit per second into a business. It simply doesn't matter. You know, you can get out of a world where you're worrying so much about queuing and tagging and what goes first when I can put a gigabit of bandwidth into the side of a business. And we've all experienced a version of this, right? A moment that really clicked for me, and I bet everybody in this room has had something similar, is I was in a hotel room in Prague, and I got out my iPhone, and I was on the hotel Wi-Fi, and I fired up Skype, and I had a perfectly acceptable conversation back to the US. Worked great. So let me get this right. I'm on hotel Wi-Fi running a latency and jitter sensitive application on an iPhone with an over-the-top environment, and it works just fine. And voice is pretty sensitive, actually. So tell me again why we have to do all this complexity at layer 2 when we're in a gigabit world. So that's how we're thinking about it. I hope it's a useful perspective. Obviously, I said at the beginning, the beauty of MEF, if it brings a lot of perspectives together, I hope this is useful to you as you think about where this goes. So thank you so much for your time. Take care.